Relations Officer Chris Nance. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. Is this on? Is this on? Okay, good. Morning, everyone. We have a distinguished panel of guests here with us today. We'll get to that in a moment. Why are we here? The biggest question is, do we have a behavior problem? And so far as behaviors are concerned, relative to preparedness for disasters, and more specifically for earthquakes. And there's a lot of work that's been done by folks here at the table, the CEA included. I want to open by introducing some of our panelists. I'm going to read to you really quickly some of their background information because that's so darn relevant to this conversation. These folks are second to none when talking about behaviors around preparedness for disasters and what some of the barriers may be and what we've learned about how we can step around some of those behaviors perhaps and collectively, strategically work together to help make a difference. I want to start with Dennis Maletti, Dr. Dennis Maletti. If you go online to learn more about Dennis, you'll see him in C-SPAN videos at the National Press Club talking about preparedness. You'll see him in his home with a city official where he lives talking about the preparedness actions that he's taken up. I don't know anybody else who is as well prepared as Dr. Dennis Maletti. The video that you'll watch about him will enable you to see Dennis talking about not one but two tents he has planned for, or has three tents, pardon me. One large enough to stand up in. He also has air conditioning for his tents. He plans to be set in those tents for not days, but potentially longer. He is second to none so far as preparedness goes, not only as an expert around the social science and human behavior, but also as a practice in his own home. Let me tell you a little bit about Dennis. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where he served as director of the Natural Hazards Center and as chair of the Department of Sociology. Dr. Maletti is author of over 100 publications, primarily regarding the societal aspects of hazards and disasters. He's written a book called Disasters by Design, summarized a national effort to assess knowledge and policy in the U.S. for hazards and disasters. Dr. Maletti is founder of and co-editor-in-chief of the journal Natural Hazards Review. So we have Dennis here, who will talk in a moment. I want to quickly also introduce Cheryl Rabinovich. Cheryl worked very closely with the CEA. I should say that I keep close to me on my desk at all times from Dennis what I refer to as the purple pages. It's a presentation I remember him presenting back in 2008, if I remember correctly. Also on my desk, I have a report from the, it's a post-Napa report conducted by Cheryl on behalf of the CEA talking about retrofitting. These two things guide everything we do at the CEA, from communications to mitigation. Let me tell you a little bit more about Cheryl. Cheryl received her PhD in public policy from the University of California, Berkeley, with an emphasis on natural disaster risk communication, decision-making, organizational behavior, economics, and program design and evaluation. In 2004, she founded an independent consulting practice in the Bay Area. And with that effort, she works with many of the entities we've seen here attending this conference, including the Applied Technology Council and the U.S. Resiliency Council. Cheryl, we're thrilled to have you here, and thank you for the evergreen work that you've done that guides us every day. Finally, we have Peter Herrick from FEMA. Additionally, if you, like with Dennis, if you Google Peter, you'll see him sitting at news desks in Houston.
Please don't Google that.
Pardon me?
Please don't Google that.
Yeah.
It's not a fun time in my life.
Yeah. You'll see Peter talking with reporters about federal assistance. And that's a responsibility we know well at the CEA. We often have that responsibility. As recently as a few weeks ago, I was speaking down in the San Diego area. Before breakfast, I was watching the news, and I watched a reporter talk about federal assistance is coming to San Diego following the fires to help people rebuild their homes. And we all know that that's not what federal assistance is all about. But even the TV journalists struggle with the awareness for the information that's right compared to the information is wrong. So again, we have behavior challenges with those who are communicating with vast audiences. Peter has a history at FEMA that goes back to 2010. He's had a number of different positions there. He currently works as a data and communications specialist. He's also been a policy and doctrine specialist, an operational planner, external affairs specialist. And I also want to note one of the more interesting roles that he's played is not in the workplace, rather it's as an ice hockey official. And I find that interesting, having grown up in the Great White myself. That sport moves very quickly, and it comes often with hostile confrontations, not unlike working with journalists at a news desk talking about federal assistance. So he's well equipped for his job, both at work and in his free time. We're very fortunate to have these three folks. We want to get going here with learning first from Dennis. The purple pages I've referred to are not only instrumental for us at the CEA, but they serve as guideposts for those of us who work with the Great California Shakeout, the Earthquake Country Alliance. It's not only here for use here in California, but now it's an international effort. So the guidance that Dennis has brought to us is far-reaching. Dennis, can you tell us more? Take 10, 15 minutes or so to do so.
Happy to do that.
Thank you,
Chris. A few years ago, the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate became concerned that Americans were not prepared to deal with terrorist attacks and wanted to learn what steps they needed to take to increase preparedness amongst American households. So they asked me and Linda Bork at UCLA and Meg Kano who's in Japan, and a few other leading scholars in this area to do a project that could produce definitive results that they could use for guidance. We took every dollar they were willing to give us. They gave us so much money to do this project, we had money left over and gave it back. That doesn't happen to social science much. So this ended up being the Manhattan Project of how you motivate people to prepare. And given that we're all earthquake nuts, we snuck earthquakes into it. And then when this project was over, I was a seismic safety commissioner at the time and commissioned a study of the entire state of California to see if we could replicate the findings here specifically for earthquakes. So let me just tell you what we did. First of all, the basic question was simple. How do you get people to stop doing what they're doing, listen to what you have to say, to learn, and then the only thing that matters, take steps to get ready? For what? Disasters that, oh, excuse me. I got too excited. Disasters that most people think won't really happen, and if they do, will happen to someone else. That we learned is true in California for earthquakes. We also learned it was true in the Bay Area. It was true in Southern California. It was true in the Central Valley and in places like Fresno. Californians are no more prepared in the Bay Area and Los Angeles than they are anywhere else in the state, at least based on the data that we had collected at the time. So why don't people perceive risk? Because every day they go through life and an earthquake doesn't happen is evidence for them that they don't need to worry about earthquakes. When do you have people's attention? After they go through an earthquake. Earthquake preparedness supplies skyrocket in sales, and stores sell out after an earthquake happens. It happened after Loma Prieta, it happened after Northridge, it happened after this earthquake, that earthquake, and the ones in our future. Well, that's kind of like when the horse is out of the barn. So what we tried to do was find out what can we learn and say. We went through the research record for the last 60 years, 6 decades worth of research on this topic by psychologists, social psychologists, sociologists, people in public health, et cetera, and developed a list of correlates. That's something that some researcher found correlated with preparedness behavior. One is the information people got, like the Red Cross hands out. Others is information they observe, like seeing their next door neighbors' supplies, their statuses, like income, education, occupation, their roles, like whether they have children or pets, their experiences with disasters, whether they believe the information they got, their level of knowledge about how to prepare, their perception of risk, the perception of the effectiveness of different actions that they're being asked to take, and talking about it with others. And we measured all of those factors and did a Manhattan Project style study. The study produced, you need to get on the edge of your seat to listen to what I'm about to say, impeccable results. We took a random sample of the entire United States of America. In addition to that, we took a random sample of African Americans in America. We took a random sample of Hispanics in America, Native Americans in America, a random sample of people in New York City, a random sample of people in Los Angeles, and a random sample of people in Washington, D.C. We did incredibly complex statistical analyses and ran all the data through complex models using multiple regression, where you can see the true effect of factor A while you're controlling for 8 other factors, and ferret out the real influence that that factor has. Correlations between A and B don't tell you much. That may be spurious and not actually tell you the truth. And here's the kicker. All of those analyses on different samples produce the same results. That's unheard of in the social sciences. That usually doesn't happen. And I'm going to skip forward and just to tell you that what we found was that 3 things, how many? 3 things motivate Americans to prepare. And remember when I said we replicated this study in California and found the same conclusions? So if you want to know from a social behavioral point of view what motivates people to prepare, here are the 3 things. One, and the one with the strongest effect on motivating preparedness, is when people observe the actions that their peers have taken. It's not when mama says, here's a checklist, go do this. Did your mother ever tell you to do stuff? How many times did you do it? Have you ever told your kids to do stuff? How many times have they done it? When are you going to give that model up? When you see people you know, you love, you trust, share with you what they've done. That is, you've observed it and heard it in your ongoing life. So I use that in my home when I have people over for dinner. I drag them over to a sideboard in my living room and I say, try shaking that statue. And they say, it doesn't move. I said, I know, try shaking the box it's on. And they say, it doesn't move. And I say, I know. And I say, try shaking the table it's on. And they try and it doesn't move. And they say, why doesn't any of it move? And I said, well, I have it that way so that doesn't kill us or injure us in an earthquake. I live in California. I don't tell them to do it, but I know what they have as a conversation in the car when they're driving home. It's something like this. Harry, when are we going to glue stuff down? That's the #1 factor that motivates human beings. It also happens to explain anthropological research 100 years ago about how the spread of pottery amongst the Anasazi Indians occurred. It's how human beings are. It's called, you're going to remember this the rest of your lives, monkey see, monkey do. Okay, the other factor, the second factor, is the content of the information. What we learned in all of our analyses is that telling people about the risk, how bad the earthquake's going to be, or how high the new probabilities have risen, turns people off. It's like the 60s come back. They tune out, drop out, don't listen. I've been telling this to seismologists, but they can't give it up. What content actually gets them to prepare? What the content that gets them to prepare is when you tell them what to do to prepare. Give them information about what to do to prepare. It's kind of like this. Any of you ever raise a little kid? Raise your hand so I know. Okay, any of you ever teach them how to put on their shoes? Probably went something like this. And if you never raised a little kid, probably you can remember being one. And it goes like this. No, no, no. That shoe goes on the other foot. Here, let Daddy show you how to do it. Okay, now you try it. And you were teaching them the actions you wanted them to take. Did you explain to them that if they didn't wear shoes and walked on snow and ice, that they'd get frostbite and might have to have toes amputated? Did you explain the risks to them of walking on hot concrete around a Palm Springs swimming pool? You didn't. You focused on the actions you wanted to take. Well, that's true for earthquake preparedness. It's the content should be on what you want people to do. And last, we discovered, and remember, this is for all people in the country, all racial and ethnic minority groups, people in New York City, people in LA, people in Washington, D.C., replicated, is delivery. The information, there is no single spokesperson who could accomplish this mission. Has to be coming from multiple sources, delivered through multiple channels, and it works best if they're all speaking with one voice. This is the model we've adopted in the state of California. And who adopted it is the Southern California Earthquake Center. Mark Benthian got everybody together, standardized the message. This whole thing is part of the shakeout when that was put in place. And we're trying our best to put these things into practice. So what recommendations I came up with when we finished the original research were these, and I just want to read them to you. Use evidence-based approaches to what you're doing. Stop making things up because you think it'll work. Use science and what science has to say about what motivates people to prepare, rather than unique inventions that you had last month because you watched a TV show. And that's what we're doing in California. Second, stop doing things that don't work. Don't try to motivate the public with producing higher fear. It doesn't motivate them. it actually detracts from motivating them. Third, use multiple information sources. Regardless of who you are, you alone can't provide very effective public information. It doesn't matter if you're California Earthquake Authority or the Governor's Office of Emergency Services or the Southern California Earthquake Center or the Red Cross or whoever. You've got to all get in the game together. It takes a community, and we need to standardize the message. That's step 4. And this is a big one because we have a hard time with this because it really isn't about the public and trying to motivate them. If we really wanted to do that, we'd speak with one voice, and we don't. When I say we, I mean organizations. We want our own PR. It's about us, not about the people. And so if you go to the Red Cross and look at their message, it's a little unique and different from FEMA's. And if you go to FEMA and look at their message, it's a little unique and a little slightly different from the Red Cross, and certainly inconsistent with what we're saying here in California about earthquakes, because they're thinking about the nation as a whole. And so we still have multiple messages going out that's shooting a hole in our foot. And I have told publicly this to the Red Cross and FEMA, and had fun doing it, and they had fun listening to it. But you know bureaucracies, it's really hard to move the Titanic when it's headed toward the iceberg. Step 5, use multiple dissemination channels. People do more when they hear the message over and over and over again, regardless of where they turn. They see it on a billboard, they hear it on TV, they hear it on the radio, so on and so forth. And communicate the message over the long haul. If you stop communicating to the public the need to prepare, they will stop preparing. It'll go out of their mind. End of story. Coca-Cola knows that. The minute they stop spending money on advertising, even after selling that product for 100 years, and who in the world doesn't know about Coca-Cola, sales plummet. They turn on the advertising and sales go back up. Same thing with this. And focus information on actions, what people should do to prepare, and explain how those actions reduce consequences. You must explain how those reactions reduce consequences. You must explain how the actions people are being asked to take reduce consequences. And I've heard, just in the short time I've been in this room, people talking about doing just that. Makes me really happy. Can't wait to hear more about it. And do evaluations of your work. So a few more points, and then I'll stop talking. And that is, we took all these findings. We had almost $1 million to survey the state of California. We had a statistically representative sample of people in the Bay Area, the whole Bay Area, Southern California. What part of Southern California? The one that's going to experience the next great Southern California earthquake, Riverside, LA, et cetera. And then the state as a whole, and did this study over again. Why? Because I was a seismic safety commissioner, the only sociologist in human history to ever sit on that group, and we did another survey. Guess what we found out? Same thing for earthquakes in California. So that's the background, the theoretical stuff. I'll never have the chance to do a piece of research again in my life that was as well funded as that. And I was happy to turn it over to so many good people here in California who are using it effectively. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to share that with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Now you have an understanding for why the Purple Pages have left such an evergreen impression with us. And I will say at the CEA, we've invested more than $1 million in research since listening to Dennis. And we have corroborated what Dennis just shared with us more than a dozen times. So you're right again, and you're right again, over and over again. Thank you very much. Speaking of research and results that have proved invaluable not only to the CEA, but throughout the Napa region and beyond, Cheryl, can you tell us a little bit about what you learned in your study post-Napa?
I'm going to cover a lot of different terrain because this topic is really exciting to me, and I just want to compliment the CEA first because we saw the results of the communication work that the campaigns you've been doing the last couple of years in the data about insurance purchase and in the programs that you're initiating like EBB I see billboards, I see the simple messages, I see the new information about policy options, and you're responding to evidence-based research, and one of the few organizations that I really see doing that. So I think this is a great place to be. So thank you for inviting me. I view these kinds of events, they're really fun for me. They're opportunities to step back and revisit what we know and how we know it and look for new opportunities, how to translate new innovations in other fields, rather than reinvent the wheel. I call it intellectual arbitrage. You just, move something over that someone else is experimenting with and is ahead of you. Earthquakes is kind of a small game. And we have to borrow what works from other people and apply it. I'm more of an applied researcher. My work, I like to think about as translating insights into interventions. I do some work that is about generating insights, but it's mostly trying to help us design interventions and iterate in those interventions through evaluation towards better outcomes, magnifying our impacts. So replicability, scalability, evaluation, those are all things that are dear to my heart. When invited to this panel, technical design and virtual reality, the example we're going to be talking about in a minute, are not my direct areas of expertise. But beliefs and behaviors about risk and the design of policies and programs to influence beliefs and behavior, that is my area of expertise. So I tried to combine in my thoughts here a little reading up on virtual reality, and match that together with some general risk policy, risk management, and social science precepts, and my own research, including this post-Napa study that I was engaged in with CEA, which was about homes and homeowners, and I think kind of setting a new bar for behavioral research that combines with engineering and home inspection research, trying to unite those two types of knowledge to come up with, to magnify our impact in our interventions. So some comments, recommendations, and fodder for discussion. This is the kind of thing I think should be open. I'm going to present maybe a little bit of a broader view around the behaviors than Dennis presented. And this is kind of how I was trained. This is not exactly the kind of research that I do, but it informs what I do. So individual behavior, in the social sciences, we have three main ways to study it. We have psychology, we have, which is about personalities and development and things like that. And then you have social psychology, which is about interactions between people and how that's affected by personality, but also other things. And then we have sociology, which is the systems in which those other things develop. But inside a person, an internal system for beliefs and behavior, it's really about three things. It's about cognition. So what do you deliberately think and deliberately try to learn or perceive that from observation and other experiences that you have learned. So it's kind of like your conscious thinking. You have your emotional and associative system, and that is learned behaviors through, repeated experiences, yeah? And then you have your physiological system, which is like the biology part, your stress hormones, your heart rate, your how much you sweat, your flinching, those kinds of reactions. And all those systems are complementary, but they also conflict sometimes, and they don't always work great together. As for external influences on risk-related behavior, one of the dominant theories that kind of guides my thinking is it's got a great acronym, as do all things, SARF, the Social Amplification of Risk Framework. It's also social attenuation of risk framework, because what we see and observe in risk-related behaviors in the world is some things get more attention than they probably observe from a cognitive analytical point of view, and some things get less attention than they should from a cognitive analytical point of view. So why is that? What are the systems around people that push us in one direction or another, both us as individuals and our social systems and institutions? So SARF is about information flow. It's about actors and institutions, their motives, their incentives, why they're pushed to emphasize one thing or another. And this produces public reactions to a risk that are either excessive or under-attentive relative to that cognitive assessment. So risks for which we lack personal repeated experience and feedback tend to be the most affected by the external factors. So earthquakes, we got the perfect storm there. You know, this is a risk that we only learn how to deal with in general through the social system. We cannot use a lot of our personal behavior forming mechanisms in order to learn how to respond. And numerous studies show this to be true. So I'm absolutely on the same page as Dennis. There's total consensus on this. It is the social environment in general that informs our risk behavior about earthquakes. We also know a lot about what not to do. Behavior about risk has been studied extensively, not just in earthquakes, you know, primarily in other fields. And we know what a lot of the pitfalls are. Negative threat messages don't work. The importance of the source of the information and the trust relationships there. When looking at the possibility of developing interactive technology and virtual, for example, virtual reality for earthquake risk reduction, how does it match up with these different understandings of how risks are perceived? I know Dennis has some issues with the word perception, but perceived and acted upon. I found a lot of interesting papers on uses of virtual reality in risk behavior field. The best developed ones were from public health. And they have three types: awareness, prevention, and habits. So trying to give people small doses of experiences with what we know about substance abuse, exercise, driving safety. There's also a use of VR for measurement of risk impressions. So you can learn not just about how to influence them, but how to measure what people think. You can use that in virtual reality, which I really like. It's an experimental learning tool. And you can also use it to treat people. So in a public health, you can rehabilitate or help someone develop a compensating behavior for a deficiency that they have. So that's, I think, our terrain in which we can learn a lot. We also have military and law enforcement and professional skills development, which is more about situational training and simulation of events and scenarios. That is something that we can think about because we do a lot of stuff as professionals. We can train ourselves to do it better. We can maybe train contractors to do their work better using VR. You know, that's another way to think about these interactive technologies. There's also very interesting uses of VR in engineering, urban planning, construction, and architectural design. And this is kind of the, what's that Tom Cruise movie? Where he's manipulating, you know, information on like a touch screen with, the name will come to me. It's Minority Report, thank you. It's interactive and you're actually using the technology to create your design. So you're forming something in virtual reality using those perceptual tools there. There's also some examples of this kind of technology in education, so a purely informative purpose to make the conveyance of information more exciting, memorable, It's used in sales, so persuading people to do something, and it's used in entertainment. So it has a lot of potential. There's a lot of experiments there. We can learn from that. In general, effectiveness, like what can we expect from trying to innovate more in this domain of interactive technology for our behavior issue? I've got a couple of thoughts on that, and I might kind of stop with some of my comments, let you do your demo, and then try and circle back to a few of them. But in general, there is potential here that's exciting and ought to be thought about. Virtual reality has the potential to activate all three of those individual signal channels that I talked about: the cognitive, the emotional, associative, and the physiological. Okay, that sounds good. It is a mode of engagement with people that takes advantage of all three of those things. It also is a social signal activation activity. So, you cared enough to spend the money to make it. That's actually one of the primary, most important social signals that a VR does. Okay, everybody knows that kind of technology is difficult to spend. You care about your status, you care about your money. The fact that you went through the trouble to make it means you're serious about this risk. The people who have that kind of money and power are serious enough about this risk. That itself is an important social signal. It sends a message that elites are, paying attention and investing in this concern. It also starts the storytelling process. People learn very well through narratives and stories from people like themselves. So the participant in a virtual reality or an interactive tech gets their own story. You create a story with them, and then you give them a way to tell their story. So that storytelling activation in the social network speaks really well. What was the first thing you said when you came out of experimenting with this virtual technology today? What was the first thing you said? Cool. Cool. Who did you say it to?
The young woman who organized it.
Okay, you gave her some positive feedback. Who else did you talk to about it?
My co-founder.
Uh-huh. Did you, what do you think you will say to people you know when you go home from this event? What are you going to talk to them about when they ask about your day or your trip? Is that going to be on your list?
Yeah, I wish everybody could have that experience.
Is that something novel that you saw in this environment? It is going to be part of your story of what you did during this event. So it kind of magnifies that and will ripple out through the conversations that we have with people. It opens possibilities. That's another thing I like about it. Curiosity, surprise, and outrage are three of the most important things to trigger in people to get attention. So those are things we want to cultivate. We don't want to answer all the questions. We want to pique curiosity in our advertisements. We want to surprise people with information that they didn't know, because that causes them to, is this consistent with what I know? Why is it different? It's a change. So surprise is a big ace in our pocket, ace in our sleeve, and it's also disarming. So surprise makes you feel more receptive, okay? It opens you a little. And outrage is very effective as a behavior motivator in the risk domain. That's that social amplification of risk effect. That's usually part of it, is I'm really pissed off that my government is not investing in this problem that is hurting people or has the potential to hurt me. Outrage is really on your side, but it's very delicate as public practitioners of risk communication to tap into that tool. It's very judgmental, and that's not really one that's very easy to use. I'm going to stop there and let you do your presentation. I tried to set you up well by talking about some of the good reasons to be excited about this technology, and we can circle back and talk more. I hope that's been a helpful introduction to how I frame thinking about this, and excited to hear more from the audience and continue this learning process. We're experimenting, and that's good. That's how we learn, and that's how we improve.
Thank you, Cheryl. Before we finish today, we want to make sure we circle back to hear a little bit about the study and some of the takeaways, but we'll come back around to that.
I do have advice on that.
Okay, so we have another panelist here to talk with us about a project important to FEMA. I want to talk about this a little bit from where we sit with CEA, and in doing so, talk about how we've come to evolve to a place where we can truly appreciate lots of different things that we can be doing in the marketing space. As marketing practitioners, what we're always struggling with is whether there's a silver bullet somewhere. Is there any one thing that we can say, or any one marketing tactic that we can engage that will make a difference, will change the world? Dennis spoke to this a little bit earlier. That's indeed not how we know not to work like that. Instead, it's about having the right message. It's about knowing how to reach people and where with the right message, and it's about having as many people as possible, or organizations, sharing the same message. Cheryl talked about the TV ads, the billboards, there's direct mail. There are a number of things
Stickers on newspapers.
There are a number of things that we have out and about all the time. We're $65 million down the road with CEA marketing. From an earthquake brace and bolt perspective, if you look at the number of incentives administered through the end of this year, we're $18 million down the road. This is a high-cost endeavor. It's a big state. There's a lot at stake. And we have challenges that start with people not interested in the conversation. They think it won't happen to them. If it does happen in their area, they think it will affect someone else. Does this sound familiar, Dennis?
It does.
And so along comes what looks and feels like a magic bullet or a silver bullet. It's not so much a silver bullet, but it is a giant step forward in a capability enabling us to overcome one of the biggest barriers to helping people think about earthquakes, and that comes with the out of sight, out of mind, infrequent occurrence of a damaging earthquake. It's been 20 plus years. Along comes a virtual reality capability that perhaps may enable people to experience that infrequent event at their leisure. One last thing I want to say is, and this, I'm going to make a little fun of myself in doing so. Janelle and a guy named Bruce Patton, most of you know who Bruce is, and I had the high honor of visiting the Stanford Virtual Reality Lab. And I would say, Janelle, we didn't really know what to expect, right, when we walked into this place. Of course, it's a beautiful campus, and it was a beautiful day. It wasn't freezing there like it was this morning when we arrived. And so we walk into this room, and it's the size of a large bedroom. You know, what is that? Maybe 15 by 30, something like 25 by 25. Thank you, Janelle. And so it's carpeted, and the walls have this nice velour type look and feel. And I thought, look, this is all set up for sound. And the person leading the presentation, fascinating guy, talking about all the different applications for virtual reality in our society, which when thinking about it's an amazing, they're all behavioral in nature, what they're talking about. And what he was describing, but I wasn't prepared to understand, was what happens in your head when you experience virtual reality. The behaviors that are, call them hardwired, that are taking place, that when you experience it, you step away and maybe you have more familiarity. But this was the first time for me. So Janelle and Bruce were standing on the side. I was the first guinea pig. I pulled on the goggles, and I was asked to walk across a board that was maybe 8 feet in length across a bottomless pit. And I thought to myself, this is a no-brainer. I'm in this lovely room, and I'm on carpet, and what can go wrong? And so I pulled on the goggles, and I got a couple of steps into that and found myself lunging for the other side of the pit. Then I realized, after I pulled off the goggles and everyone stopped laughing, the velour on the walls was padding for people who lunge off that board and careen into the wall. And the walls are padded to prevent people like me from hurting myself. I knew I was on carpet. I knew I was in a safe space. But the experience that was brought to me through that technology was incredible. So we had conversations following that that presentation about what we can be doing with virtual reality to help people come along this continuum in preparedness and ideally experience things that, as Dennis and Cheryl have talked about, come very infrequently. And so we have here with us Peter, who comes from FEMA. I will say that the PR firm that they are working with to help with all of this, I've worked with twice, in Chicago and in Sacramento, so I'm familiar with their good work. And Dennis also talked about across all disasters, not just earthquake, but of course we're focused on earthquake here. So I want to say that as part of introducing what Peter's going to talk about in the name of flood. How many of you have had the opportunity to experience? Did you find yourself leaping from a board to escape the bottomless pit? But you will agree that in your head, things happen that are not explainable, really, for those of us who are not experienced in that capability. So with that as a setup, Peter, can you tell us about how this came to be and what your experience has been with this experience to date? And then we'll circle back to panelists to talk about the research they've done to date and with awareness for virtual reality, not as a silver bullet, but as an important tool in our toolkit. Again, I'm using Dennis's words, that might help us create more interest for this conversation for people in this genre, if you will, who will find this interesting. So Peter, take it away.
Thank you. With all of that, it feels like I have a huge part of the panel to hold up, so thanks for setting me up, and I hope not to let you down. So as Chris talked about, obviously this is designed for flooding in large part because at FEMA, flooding is what pays our bills in terms of this area. Thank you, National Flood Insurance Program. So while the scenario is based on flood, a lot of what we're going to talk about and a lot of the experience is applicable to any risk. It just so happens that that's what pays the bills, so that's what we got to do first. There's a lot that goes into it. You guys have set up, and I've tried to sit here quietly and not go, we're doing something about that. So I'm going to try and touch on a lot of it. A large part of it is the National Flood Insurance Program has been around for 50 years. And for 50 years, we have been saying if people just knew their risk, they would do something. And part of that is because we would talk to people and they would say, if I just knew my risk, I would do something. And there's a small problem with that. They're lying. And so we could tell them their risk till we're blue in the face, and we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars every year to try and map their risk and be able to educate them. And they say, yeah, that's great, but it's never flooded here, so you must be wrong. The science must be wrong. There's no way that my experience could be wrong. There's no way that risk changes. And so I'll tell a quick story. Chris, in my intro, talked a little bit about Houston. So I was down in Houston as the only spokesperson after Harvey for 6 weeks. And I say, please don't YouTube it because it's a very traumatic time in my life. And I'd prefer not to revisit it. There are 2 reservoirs outside of Houston, the Addicks and the Barker's Reservoir, and there were plans for a third, and you're going to hear that they're trying to build a third despite there not being any place for one, which is anyway. There are people that live on the right side of the reservoir, and then Houston is allow unchecked development for a long period of time. There are people that live inside the reservoir. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with reservoirs, but living inside of a reservoir is a very bad idea if you're trying to be safe from water. So we'd go to town hall meetings, and I would talk to people that were inside the reservoir and talk to people that were outside the reservoir. And you know what they all told me? I was on the safe side. If you hadn't let those other people build, I would have been fine.
Amazing we're still on the planet.
Right, it is amazing we're still on the planet. Not the 64 inches of rain, which the reservoir wasn't going to protect. They all said that they should have been safe and it was someone else's fault. They knew. They'd talked to people, and so they were fine. So when I say that those people are lying, when they say if they just knew the risk, they would do something, case in point. So we realized, thanks to a lot of the research that's been done, that we needed to find another way to communicate this to them. And all of the data in the world isn't going to solve that problem for most people. There's a saying in Descartes' error, we're not thinking machines, we're feeling machines that think. And so we started to try and address that guttural reaction, which is exactly what virtual reality has done. I know that only a handful of you had raised your hands about going through it, but how many of you had stopped at one point and watched someone go through it? Looked a little bit on the TV. All right, much bigger number.
John Osrich shook my hand when that guy was like, when you were leading him out of the building. That was creepy. Really not fair, buddy.
So we're going to start setting people up to stand around the corners now to see what those interactions look like. There was one person, I don't remember who it is, so I'm not picking on anyone, but as you go through, there's a part where you're trying to escort people to a safe area, and despite the fact that we're in a convention center in Sacramento on the 2nd floor, this person was saying, come with me, follow me, and trying to talk to these interactive cartoons. And I say that not to make fun of that person in any way, shape, or form, though it is entertaining, much like watching someone try and avoid a board that isn't there. I say that because for as much as you stand on the outside and look at the experience and say, oh, that's kind of cool, but it's not going to change my mind. When you put it on and you start walking through it, even though it's very clearly a cartoon, which is done to prevent people from freaking out because it's too real for them, they get immersed in the system and they really believe and feel it. And there's a guttural reaction. And so as you walk through, it shows you what your risk may be. And then it shows you what the benefits are of taking some action and how the same scenario would be different. Much to the point of not just telling them, but showing them how taking action reduces their consequences. So the system as it's designed now is designed for a community official. We've rolled it out at the National League of Cities, the National Association of Counties, a couple of other conventions, the American Planning Association. You guys are actually event number 30 this year, so congratulations. We've had about 1,200 people go through it. And we've designed it for these people who are decision makers on the bigger picture. So it's not designed for individuals at this point. But as you look at how to solve problems for your community, you can see what the benefits of those actions are. As we talk a little bit about the development of it, and I'll talk a little bit about the second iteration, it's actually based on an experiment done at Stanford, I'm sure in the same VR lab, where people were asked to cut down redwoods. Now, I don't know exactly what that looked like, but I'd love to see someone trying to do the chainsaw. People that did that drastically reduced the amount of lumber they consume. Not actually cutting it down, but seeing for themselves what the impact is and what the end result is. It sounds ridiculous, right? I mean, it sounds crazy that a video game would stop people from cutting things down. But it did. So it's based on a lot of that same setup of if we walk people through and show them the consequences or lack of consequences of their action or inaction, that we can start to move and shape the conversation. It also means that it isn't just FEMA. While we have a reputation in this room, thanks to Mike, hopefully a good one. If not, then it's definitely Mike. With the general public, we tend not to have a great reputation, and there's a whole host of reasons for that, some deserved, some undeserved. Part of what this does by putting it in the hands of community officials is it lets them be the person in their community. They're already trusted. I don't need the credit. I mean, as great as it is, my paycheck is the same whether I get the credit for it or not. And if it ends up being the silver bullet, then you can bet I'll resign and go start my own consulting firm and not tell anyone how we got here. But in the interim, it's not about credit. We don't need to be the end-all, be-all. We want to get this in the hands of other people. Many voices, same message, and that helps us along that way. So hopefully that's a good enough background for how we got here. In terms of where we're going, we've seen huge results. Again, we are the beneficiaries of getting to go and do the cool stuff that we were told to do by the smart people. The next iteration, this is obviously a pretty substantive setup. For those of you that may have seen Fontana and I putting it together, it's 3 large Pelican cases. It's pretty expensive to ship. It's run on a desktop computer, and only one person can go through every 5-6 minutes. It's a great experience, but it obviously has some limitations. So there's 2 things that we're doing to move this forward. One is we're going to disconnect it from this sort of setup. This is still going to exist because it's great for conferences because people see it and they go, oh, that's cool, I want to play. We're going to move to a Samsung VR system. Just a quick headset that you can have, doesn't require the huge desktop computer. People will be able to download it on their phones and do it at home. We've had people say, that's crazy, no one's going to download it at home. And then we've had other people say, there's literally nothing in the VR space, everyone's going to download this. So either we're going to look like geniuses or we're going to reinforce our reputation. So we're going to get this into more people's hands so that way more people can go through it, and it doesn't just have to be at our behest. The other thing it does is it empowers local officials to have the right conversations with people. The other thing we're doing is we're adding a different scenario. So this is obviously still going to exist with the current community official setup. But we're going to change it so that way there's also a homeowner one. This tends to be bigger picture solutions, and much to the point of trying to help people with smaller, easier to accomplish solutions. I mean, as much as we want people to just leave flood risk areas, turns out they're not going to do that, and it costs a lot of money, so they're not going to do that. What we're going to do is start to show them, hey, this is what a home like yours would look like if a flood happens. Here's what it would look like if you took some small mitigation actions. Here's how you could reduce your risk despite going through the exact same scenario. And so that way they can start having those conversations while they may not have done it, and they won't have the experience that Dennis has when he goes over to people's house, when people come over to his house for dinner. They will be able to say, hey, listen, I saw this thing, and talk to their friends about it and say, I've seen what this can do. I've seen how easy this can be and how we can drastically reduce our risk. So again, all of this is based on flood. Long term, you see a little bit where we're going. We want to be able to open up to more risk. Part of that is Congress, so call your congressman. Not that I would ever lobby for anything like that, because there's no way I would want Congress to give us more money. So, not enough of you laughed at that it was a little too real, so I understand. The other piece of it is we want to be able to get this into people's hands and make it very clear for them. Risk is a complicated thing. This is one tool. It is not the silver bullet. It capitalizes on a lot of the research to help shift the conversation. But there's a lot of other things that we're doing surrounding this. And I'd be happy to talk about those offline with people if you want. I think that sort of lays out how we got here and what we're doing. I'd much rather refer back to a conversation. So hopefully I captured everything you guys were looking for and didn't let you down.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Peter. Well, let's open up the conversation a little bit now. I want to come back to the conversation Janelle and I had as we were leaving the Stanford lab. First of all, she was still laughing at how silly I looked leaping from that board. But secondly, We couldn't talk fast enough about the applications for that. So let's think about all the things we went through yesterday. We talked about crawl spaces, we talked about drones, we talked about rat families in the attic and skunks in the crawl space. We talked about going back in time as necessary to see what a house looked like before there was damage. Perhaps now we're talking about going ahead in time to the future to look at what a house may feel like following significant damage from an earthquake. And so Janelle and I were talking about, from an education perspective, within the engineering community, holy moly, what could we be doing there? When we're looking at home inspectors, again, holy moly, what could we be doing there? Could we be working with Stanford, with FEMA, with entities associated with not a silver bullet here, but an opportunity that's just so ripe for us to tackle? Moreover, for people, Cheryl talked yesterday in a question about her house. And when shopping for a house, all were the same in their state of, well, generally the same in their state of unretrofittedness. And so to have some sort of visual representation around what it might be now compared, hang on just for a second.
Yeah, I do.
But where I'm going with this is, with what Dennis was talking about, it won't happen to me. It'll happen to somebody else. The out of sight, out of mind, infrequency of devastating events. The preparedness conversation is prerequisite to doing anything with retrofitting or with insurance. We learned that through our values-based research, that it's a continuum that starts with the simple stuff and has to move along to decisions that are more complicated, more involving. And whether it's flood insurance or earthquake insurance, disaster preparedness, even for terrorism, people generally just want to get back to normal after things happen. Of course, they don't want to be harmed. But you start from different places with more complicated decisions. Where I'm going with this is the tools like this can enable us to potentially speed up the process that comes with people involving themselves with this conversation, if only as entertainment like we with your kids, that you're opening up as a package, you know, under the Christmas tree. I'd like to come back around to Dennis and to Cheryl, for Dennis to talk a little bit about the infrequency of events and how technology might help us bring around frequency for something that maybe we won't see for the remainder of our lifetime here in California, but we sure as heck ought to be ready for it in case it happens. And then Cheryl, we'll move down the table to you to talk as the values research would suggest, in an area of more specificity with the retrofitting and the experiences that you helped us glean from people in Napa following the earthquake around what they knew about their houses before compared to afterwards. So Dennis, do you mind kicking off, just thinking aloud about what this tool and things like this in technology?
Not at all. I'm quite optimistic about it. I'm jealous that I haven't had a chance to experience it. I hope you all develop something like it for earthquakes, and I want to be the first person to go through it. However, what I was thinking about for the first time is I've become a local. I'm totally immersed in my local community, and I just love being a local. It's like where the rubber meets the road. I get asked to give talks almost every month to a different homeowners association in the desert. And what I started doing is I collected, and this is about technology. I want to share this story. It's not about this technology, but I think there's something that's transferable perhaps, is I have a slideshow. I spent months going through the internet looking for photos of California earthquakes, beginning with the Long Beach earthquake and ending with the most current one. I have a picture of a locomotive that fell over, bright yellow, in the Whittier Narrows earthquake. I have a picture of a collapsed parking structure with the car dangling next to someone's front door in an apartment building in the Northridge earthquake. I have a picture of a monk standing on the steps of the Santa Barbara Mission with rubble all over the steps. You could only imagine what he might be thinking. I have a picture of women in the Santa Barbara earthquake under a patio umbrella with towels hanging down from it, wearing derby hats. Their version of a tent, which is one of my motives for having a tent. And I have it on a 6-second scrolling thing. And when I give a talk, I set it up with the HOA. I say, from the moment the first guest starts walking in, sits theater style, looking at the front of the room at the screen, I want these slides changing every 6 moments. And I think that slideshow is effective, perhaps more effective than any talk I might give, because I can see people in the audience looking. And what I think they're getting present to when they go through that is, oh, gee, California really does have earthquakes. They happen all over, and they can be damaging, and there have been a lot of them. And I can see their faces transform, and they're on the edge of the seat before I get introduced. So that's certainly not as sophisticated as virtual reality, but I could see the influence of just flashing pictures in front of people's face, robbing them of their perception that earthquakes don't happen in California, and if they do, they'll happen to someone else. And then I talk to them, given where I live in the Coachella Valley, about the impacts of the great earthquake we face and the 2008 scenario that started the shakeout, and all the detailed information we have about it, and try to connect some dots for them. So I would be interested to see this used in this arena, to see it develop for earthquakes. If it exists, California should have it. This is a terribly hazardous state when it comes to quakes. And we have people like FEMA endorsing this product, you trying it. Let's get that ball rolling. However, I want to say one more thing. When we have it, let's evaluate it, and let's do some tests. Let's get people in a room like this, show it to them, ask them if their intentions about preparing have changed, and then follow up with them a month later or 2 months later to see if they've actually engaged in mitigation and preparedness activities. If it's done on a broad scale, any number of ways to do an evaluation, relatively inexpensive research, and see what we can learn and perhaps fine-tune how it's used. So so I've gotten excited about this, and I really want to try it. I want to try the goggles. I want to see the plank.
That's great.
I'm left like there's a big missing in my
We
life.
want to see you leap from the plank.
Yeah, that's great. So we've activated Dennis's curiosity. That's one of the points I made. It activated your curiosity and got you asking questions. And it's exactly what we need to be doing. Your talk reminded me of a couple of other major risk communication best practices that VR touches on. One is the comparative information. I mentioned that yesterday. You know, we perceive through observing change and difference, and it definitely takes advantage of that. The visual, not textual, and multi-sensorial nature is really important, and imaginability. So we have this kind of great rule of thumb system, formerly a heuristic, that the ease of thinking about something, we interpret that as related to how difficult it will be to do that thing. So we sort of, if you can make it easier to think about a topic, you will think about it more, right? There's less barrier to thinking about it. So if you want to get people's attention, you make it easier to be attentive to it. You know, that really, it makes intuitive sense there. The concerns I have, or maybe just issues, 4 points I would bring up about immersed and what this kind of direction could mean for us, is first, who's it for? And I'm glad that you focused us on that and said, you know, this is targeted for a community leader kind of audience, because these are different applications. You know, these are different contexts of use, users, messages. They're different, and you're going to have to develop a different VR for each of those different user contexts of use goals, scenarios. And I'm worried about us reaching only the usual suspects. I worry about how do you reach people that you want to influence? How do you get them? How do you get access to them? Get inroads, get their time, et cetera. And that's a kind of a small group of people. But they're influential people. So, you know, there's a trade-off. So issue number 1 is who's it for? Issue number 2 is what's the point? And personalization is the stage of risk communication progress that I believe is the most important for us to target now with earthquakes. So I believe in kind of a 6 or 7 stage progression of behavior change in this domain, and I'm going to take issue with the idea that people don't think that earthquakes are a problem in California. My research shows that they know it's a problem. They are more at the stage, many people, not everybody, are convinced of the risk, but they're not convinced about whether there are achievable, affordable, effective actions available to them. So they bury their understanding of earthquake risk with not denial, but acceptance, kind of a complacency. That feels better than thinking about options I may not be able to afford, actions that I'm not sure about whether they're going to work or how big the benefits are going to be. That feels yucky to stay with. So I'm going to think about the issue less. Okay. So the facts that people are missing are about the consequences of inaction, how it feels to take action, and the benefits of taking action. It's not about, and the personalization of those things. So general awareness of earthquakes, very high. So these are findings from our Napa study. You know, there wasn't a single person I interviewed or that answered that survey who said, I don't know earthquakes are a problem. I don't believe earthquakes are a problem here. That's not the communication challenge that we're facing with earthquakes in California.
But Cheryl,
yeah.
Are you interviewing or sending that to people who have been affected by the Napa earthquake?
Yeah, it's true. And in an interview and a survey, that's a post-event survey, and even just surveying and interviewing as a social science tactic in general, it has a lot of potential sources of bias, and one of them is recollection bias. So if you're asking people about things that happened a long time ago, they're going to be biased, you know, by more recent experiences or thoughts. But I try to start working chronologically in an interview is a good tactic to pull people out of the now thought. So the first question I ask them is, when did you move to California? Were you born here? You know, was your family from here? Why did you move here? And then I ask them, did earthquakes come up in your thinking when you were moving to this state? And most of them say, yeah, I knew it was a problem, and it just, it wasn't the top thing on my list. And the second, once you get into the modern, when did you buy this house? Were earthquakes a factor in your choice of house, in your search? And then you get information that just always puts earthquakes in the picture, but lower down in the priority list than perhaps a cognitive assessment of their importance, of their overall risk exposure in life would place it. Yeah? Does that make sense?
Chris, could you tell us, have you done work to know whether or not people who are buying insurance tend to be, are people who buy CEA insurance, do they tend to be people who've recently moved to California compared to people who've grown up in California? Have you normalized for that?
We have not.
Because when we talk to insurance agents, they tell us that people who come from other states are more likely to buy insurance.
Yeah.
And people who come from Asia are the most likely to buy insurance.
We hear that anecdotally, but we
Yeah.
don't have a research result
Same with
confirming
us.
it.
It would be useful for you to learn that about your community, because it would affect your messaging, would affect our understanding of the problem.
Yeah.
I agree. So I think that VR experience I had lacked personalization for me, because I'm not a community leader. That's not who you were targeting at. It currently speaks to increasing public support for community-level flood mitigation exercises, not so much personal mitigation or action taking. But we see the potential for it to do that, right? If you had a different user case, et cetera. And along the same vein, it lacks, what am I meant to do next? Okay? So even for the community-level flood mitigator or public official, what do they do? You can put a resources URL, but the purpose of that VR was not to inform me about feasible actions that are available to me. And there's a second thing that it didn't have in it, which is risk diagnosis cues. So people need easy cues, and cues are a fancy word for like the things in the environment that you observe that give you a signal, right? So what Dennis was talking about. How do I know I have some above average risk exposure here, or what my personal risk exposure are? So that's the older home communication. That's maybe now we need to communicate about non-stuccoed homes. What are we learning through our vulnerability research and that are revealing cues that people can quickly get a sense of what box they fit in? Am I really ought to think about this? Am I probably should think about this? Am I probably not? And the more specific we can get about that, people like to have easy cues to put themselves in boxes, and the experience didn't give me any cues on either actions, risk diagnosis or actions. And the fourth point is, what does it cost to produce these experiences relative to their potential influence, relative to other ways we could spend our finite information, influence resources? Yeah? And that question is why people do communications research, not just communications material production. Yeah? Because when we have a new opportunity, we have to do the evaluation to see if this is something really valuable to add to our arsenal compared to other things we already know how to do or that we know how to work. So those are, I think, 4 important questions. So I did some brainstorming. I came up with my 5 top potential earthquake risk reduction VR applications. And the first one is the one this is related to, influencing key opinion leader beliefs about earthquake risks and mitigation potential effectiveness. Yeah? The second one is give general audiences an immersive experience. So maybe that's your homeowner, but maybe it's your real estate agents. Maybe it's your insurance agents. We have not found a route in to those very important intermediate players in homeowner perceptions. Maybe a VR for those guys, not the homeowner, is more bang for a buck VR development avenue. Okay? That's something I wanted to think about. And by the way, the general audience immersive experience, what if it was not about what it's like after an event? What if it was about what it's like to do a retrofit project? Yeah? What's it like to be someone who has completed a project and can proudly show that as a status symbol in their community? You know, what's it like to go to a public meeting and be able to explain that you've taken this action and be proud of it? Yeah? You want to give a lot of positive signals about and enrich the imaginability of the arc from where you are to where you want them to go. The third one I've got is building and damage assessment training. So what if your user case was engineers, contractors, and inspectors? You want them to know how to do a post-damage assessment. They get to walk through some different scenarios. I think that's a great potential VR application here. But it's about professional development. Now that brings up the point of how do you get people to engage with a system. So one thing you can do is what I would call a professional entry environment. So, okay, we're at a conference, we're all professionals here. It's voluntary whether you do the thing or not, but other people might see you doing the thing or not. You might feel a little like excluded if you don't do it. This is a great environment to put people in to influence voluntary behavior. Right? You can also mandate professional development and say you can't do this unless you go through this thing, which is what we do with air traffic controllers in simulation and other kinds of things. But those are entryways in. Are you going to make it voluntary? Are you going to make it mandated? And professional environment is easier to understand. It's easier to manipulate people, to push them in the behavior direction you want to go. What about the fourth application of helping people practice drop, cover, and hold on? Okay, this is just a no-brainer for me as far as creating habit. Do. I mean, that's a real, tangible, general audience application. But here's a good place to point out that marketing shows us that we have to have unique designs and messages and access points by segments in the market. So you can't really do the drop, cover, and hold on scenario of what I'm going to do in an office building if you're working with more blue-collar workers. That's going to be an alienating virtual reality experience if you don't get the context right. So you're going to have to match scenarios with realistic match drop, cover, and hold scenarios with realistic scenarios to the user's life. Yeah, so that's interesting too to think about. How are you going to segment your different audiences? And the last one is that I wanted to mention was to test and refine delivery mechanisms for early warning. So what if you used this as part of your behavioral research paradigm to understand if there truly is panic? How do people's cortisol levels raise when they are in a VR environment and get a warning? What a great tool for us to imagine out and help inform the mechanism of design for early warning.
Hold on. People don't panic when they get warnings.
I know. But
you use the word panic. Take that out of your minds. The problem with people getting a warning about a pending catastrophe is having them to believe that they're at risk and to initiate taking a protective action. Panic is a myth people in my profession, obviously not yours, have been trying to stamp out for centuries.
Oh, that's
it doesn't
not fair.
exist.
That's not fair. I believe that panic is not a problem. I think we need more. We might disagree on whether more research is required to persuade other people of that. I think if we truly put people in an experimental environment where you got to see what they did or not, then you could deal with those true issues that they experience in your design of the system and get the worry about panic out of people's equation.
It'll never leave the equation. You have new people coming in all the time, and that myth
may be true.
is global. It's inside of human cultures around the world, and it comes from the last science fiction movie that people looked at. It's panic sells tickets into theaters. It doesn't exist in the real world. In reference to warnings.
Anybody has lived in an earthquake?
Pardon?
Anybody has experienced a real earthquake, big earthquake? And I think you are right. The moment earthquake starts, panic starts. Not the early warning comes, panic starts. When the earthquake starts, you will be panicked, but not the warning comes. When the warning comes, you will be stressed, but not panicked. You have time to action, but he's right. There is no panic when you get the warning, but there will be definitely a panic once you start shaking. So
No, I disagree with that. Let me take exception to that. Remember, I'm a sociologist and social psychologist. We invented the word panic. Panic occurs when 4 conditions are present. The first is people are in, listen, a confined space like this room. Second, an event happens that lead people to believe that if they don't get out of that confined space, they will die. And that's very difficult to get people to believe, but let me give you an example about how I could convince you that you're about to die. If I blew up this row of tables, blood everywhere, blew up this row of tables, blood and bones splashing in that direction, blew up this row of tables, by now that row of tables would begin thinking if they didn't get out of the space, they were going to die. Do you get how significant that needs to be? Third, there needs to be an escape route. If there's no escape route, panic doesn't occur. And last, people need to be convinced that there isn't enough time for all the people in the confined space to traverse the escape route to save their lives. Those are 4 necessary but not sufficient conditions. The Coconut Grove fire, that existed.
panic means, maybe it's not as a panic means when I see people freeze. Either freeze or they start running without knowing what they are doing. My experience in the real earthquake in Istanbul, I have seen the 2 earthquakes. And everybody I asked, but they didn't say, everybody say, I panic. I either freeze or I start running at the time. That is, I meant panic. I don't know.
Well, correct. Then you used panic in the lay sense of the word, suggesting that people that have elevated stress or anxiety or are observing things that wouldn't have happened if the event hadn't happened, then that's the case. But
Let me step in here to transition a little bit. That's all right. Let's. I want to go back to a couple of key things that we can take away from what we've learned about the research results. Dennis, for example, talks about, as I've said before, people say. People think a disaster won't really happen. If it does, it will happen to other people, not them. We talk about disaster readiness being important. We've talked about the perceived risk to high consequence, low probability events. They don't perceive it. They perceive personal safety from nature's fury and other disaster types. With Cheryl, with her survey findings, we learned that her study documented a high proportion of unretrofitted houses with features linked to higher vulnerability, and you suggested that virtual reality could become a tool to help educate. Where I'm going with this, and where I think we need to have a little conversation before we close here in a few minutes, is next steps, research opportunities. Think of it as a couple of different tracks. We have the preparedness. Cheryl, what you were talking about relative to the drop cover hold on, that's what we experienced at the Stanford lab.
Yeah.
So the preparedness is important. The retrofitting, whether it's for people in their homes experiencing or educating contractors. From where we're coming with CEA marketing, we remember a guy named Tip O'Neill? He talked about all politics is local. earthquake preparedness is local too. Dennis talked about that. We're working to figure out how to bring home the cost of earthquake damage. And that's a personal conversation. So Cheryl, what you were talking about is spot on. We literally have to bring it home. It's beyond selling a policy, and that's important, but we have to sell a need for it. And whether it's through preparedness or how it works, so I'm just trying to prompt some comment here. Let's hear from folks, questions, comments, recommendations. Yes, ma'am.
So Cheryl mentioned that we have to borrow from other fields, other experiences. There's no point in reinventing the wheel, right? So I have a question for Dennis and Peter. So we know that if you start talking at length about something and you just drone on and on and on, people are going to tune you out. So there's got to be at some point a message. So you need a tagline, right, to get your message across. But you can't be one of fear. And so in Haiti, after the earthquake, and they were trying to figure out how to rebuild back better, they tried to educate people. They tried to take them out and they tried to show them how to build the right buildings, what an earthquake was. They tried to do all this educational experience. And in the end, what they found out was they just needed to focus on one concept, that the most important thing they wanted to get across to people was the quality of your concrete matters for building block houses. And so they just came up with good block, good house. That's it. Mm-hmm. And the message spread. Once people understood good block, good house, they started to put it together, then all the other pieces could come together. The tagline that I saw recently was, be prepared, not scared. So putting that preparedness first, as Dennis was talking about, show people how to prepare, but don't involve the fear aspect first. Dennis, do you have any insight into what sorts of, I guess, phraseology are good to open up that conversation with people? So that's my first question. I'll just ask some questions, then I'll throw it back up there. And then my second question is, the Insurance Bureau of Canada actually has a mobile earthquake simulator that they take around. And so, Peter, I don't know if you have looked into that and looked at any of the results that come out of that and see if that actually prompts, because it's one thing to get people excited about it, then it's another thing to have them actually take action on it, right? So I don't know if you've looked into what that experience has produced in Canada.
Dennis, do you want to go first?
Yes, I'll answer your first question. And I'd answer it this way. Focus first on what behavior you're interested in changing. So if you're interested in changing people's structural mitigation behavior, that's separate from if you're interested in having them duck, cover, and hold on, drop, cover, and hold, or if you're interested in having them engage in traditional household preparedness. And you may find different catchphrases for each of those different things. I've heard that the thing that's of prime interest here is reducing the cost of earthquake damage, which sounds like the key interest. The first interest is mitigating buildings. And so let me then go on and say a second piece, that we don't have to guess or ask me or anyone else what we have a hunch about what the best catchphrase would be. If you want to develop an effective catchphrase and hope that there's one to discover that can actually have an impact, as you claim it did in Haiti, maybe we could come up with one in California. Let's do some experiments, test different ones, and see which one is the most effective. And if we discover one that is, start using it. But I'd say have it be based on some empirical evidence. And that's not the kind of thing you need to talk to the whole population of the state about, you could get an appropriately stratified, diverse set of people and do some experiments with them. You can do that online. You could do that with SurveyMonkey. You don't need a statistically representative sample. You need a theoretically diverse sample. Or you could do it in the basement of a university auditorium. And if you want to know who the best person on the planet to do that is, it's Michelle Wood, Public Health, Cal State Fullerton, because she's been doing them for years. Oh, I'm sure there are other people who could do it. I just know that she has that background. So I would suggest an evidence-based approach to a catchphrase. And if we find a catchphrase that would get Californians to mitigate their structures, I think we should have it etched in gold and hang it over some freeway. Well, it wouldn't last long if it were in gold. But I'd be surprised if we could come up with something for our complex, diverse population.
Yeah.
So to your question about the Insurance Board of Canada,
Yes.
they have one.
Flag over the Bay
There
Bridge.
was one up in Alaska last year at Cordova. They have a community event. I think the state of Alaska owns it. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure we don't. It's a mobile trailer. For those of you that aren't familiar, you strap into it. It's like a little roller coaster seat, and it projects on the screen, and the whole trailer shakes. We've talked about similar experiences in VR, about going through the risk. There are a number of concerns that we have about it, and until we figure out how to address them, we're the government are a little too scared to take that many risks. A large part of it is particularly with an earthquake, there becomes a huge concern about motion sickness and vertigo and someone potentially injuring themselves with a VR system. With the trailer, they're strapped in, and if that's the answer, I think for an earthquake experience, it's probably the trailer type setup, where they have enough other touch points that it's very clear to them, and quite frankly, they can't get out and hurt themselves. For things like flooding or tornadoes, our concern is paralysis. People are going to be too overwhelmed and scared by it that they're going to miss the point, and it drives a little too much to the fear side. It's not that we're ruling it out. We think that there are just better, easier to execute opportunities at this point in time. We're still having those conversations. I think there's other ways to help people understand what the impact of those hazards would be. And since we're trying to drive action and not necessarily awareness at this point, we've made a conscious decision to focus in other places. I think it's an excellent conversation, and if I were king for a day and Congress gave me billions of dollars, we would absolutely explore it and go down that path. It's a prioritization conversation for us. I think there's plenty of opportunity there.
Regarding the fear appeal, we have only anecdotal information regarding this. We've been exploring it because of the research that comes to us in the purple pages and through Cheryl's research. We asked the question during exploration of our recent campaign called Risk is Real. And I credit our CEO for wanting to know more about this. So we asked about the fear appeal. Does this come across as a fear appeal? And we asked, what do you think about fear appeals? And people would say, no fear appeals, don't want them, don't believe in them. We heard from a couple of people who said, but maybe that's what it's going to take because we're in such a deep state of complacency. And so we'll be painfully honest with you. We weren't really sure what to do with that because there is indeed a fine line. So you'll see with the CEA campaigns, we go right up to whether it's a shaking blueprint or it's Risk is Real that's kind of cartoonish like what the FEMA folks are doing. We don't show screaming kids. We don't show blood and bones flying all over. We don't go that far, but we acknowledge that that fear appeal has, there's still some conversation to be had around how far maybe we could go if indeed what a couple of people have told us is true, which we don't know. We call it more anecdotal.
Right. So I'm of the belief that we probably need to go a little more in that direction. I am not a researcher. I don't have the science to back that up. I'm a believer because we've been trying this approach for 50 years, and I think we probably need to take the next step. And quite frankly, Fontaine's probably going to cover yours when I say this, and I hope that none of you repeat this to the lawyers or the leadership at FEMA. There isn't the political desire to get too close to that space, and more importantly, our lawyers are very risk averse, and there are absolutely some risks in moving in that direction. I'm a believer that we need to start to push that boundary a little bit, not full on like, let's show bodies on the street, but move a little more in that direction, make it a little more real for people, because I think that they need that visceral reaction. Not everyone, but many people. So that's my belief.
I'm sorry that we're so low on time, because there's a lot to say on this. The research is really clear in some ways that negative threat appeals don't work, but I think there is complementary research that it's like you just need the burner up to 3. You know, we aren't subtle enough with how we inform people. What I would say is about the negative consequences of inaction. Okay, so the motivating fear is disempowering. So when you evoke fear, you crank it up too high, you feel helpless. And you just don't want to do that when you're trying to get somebody to do something. But I do think I kind of have a theory of my own. I mean, I'd like to be working on testing it that has to do with coupling a little bit of a threat information with solution information. So could we have the 2-stage message that's risk is real, so are solutions? You know, just you need them together, because you can't get the receptivity to the threat unless you also convince people that there's good reason, benefit can come from paying attention to it. You know?
If I may add, when we say fear,
I know these words are very loaded, and it's hard to shortcut the conversation about these things. But
what I wanted to say, let me finish, and then you can feel free to comment on it. Thank you.
absolutely.
We need to explain consequences to people. And we need to tell them what actions to take. And then we need to connect those 2 dots and explain how the actions mitigate the consequences. That's not fear, but it doesn't mean you don't explain the consequences. And excluding all the consequences, thinking you don't want to scare people. But if we went to the warning area, where there's been a lot of recent activity about this, the National Weather Service, for example, has picked up the banner of putting fear in all its national warning messages, thinking that they had a hunch, their intuition told them they needed to scare people to motivate them into action. And it's not where it's been evaluated, and it really hasn't been evaluated that much. It's really not working. But the consequences need to be explained. Let me give you an example. I'll give a flood example. There's going to be a flood on a canyon. The water is going to be moving faster than a human being can run, and it will cover your rooftops. If you want to relocate north of 5th Avenue by 6 p.m., you can avoid the flood. That's how I'd word it. And I gave you that because I've recently actually came up with that actual message. I gave it some thought. I'm sure there's counterpoints for earthquakes. So it's not ignoring the event or ignoring the consequences, but handling it in appropriate ways.
Yeah.
I think we're running short on time. Janelle is now up and moving to the podium. Thank you, distinguished panelists, for your contributions to this conversation. Appreciate your time.